Welcome to our special bonus episode of The Black Hum, an addendum to our series on the history of Canada's No.2 Construction Battalion. I'm Cindy Charles. While the men of No.2 served over a century ago, the work done to piece together their history started in earnest in the 1980s. Senator Calvin Ruck began his scholarship on the battalion by interviewing surviving members, as well as widows and descendants of those servicemen who had passed. Calvin then filled in those stories with archival research, examining the service records of the battalion and the war diary left behind by Reverend William Andrew White. But the work of historians is never done. What starts out as a rough sketch is eventually filled out into a portrait of an event, a moment in time. As war records here and overseas are digitized, along with a mountain of secondary sources, historians continue to piece together a more complete picture of events. And in this process, there are certain facts about Canada's No.2 Construction Battalion that are often repeated, but in light of this new research, require a second look. As AI engines scrub the internet to synthesize all knowledge in the known universe, errors and all, we thought it might be instructive to unpack some of these facts in an episode we're calling 10 Myths About No.2. In this episode, our series producer, Ryan Barnett, is joined by historians Kathy Grant and Mathias Joost. Here's that conversation.
My name is Kathy Grant. I am the founder of Legacy Voices and Black Canadian Veterans. My father was a World War II veteran that volunteered to fight for Canada in the Second World War. And before he passed away, he said to make sure that he could get Canada to honor and recognize the contributions of its Black Canadian soldiers. My connection to No.2 Construction Battalion is that my father mentioned someone by the name of Tamus Gale, who was also a Second World War veteran and whose father was in the battalion. And he researched approximately 1,300 Black soldiers that were in the CEF, of which close to 800 had volunteered to be in No.2 Construction Battalion.
My name is Mathias Joost. I'm a retired military officer, did 32 years in the service, 18 of which were at the Directorate of History and Heritage as one of the historical officers. My introduction to No.2 Construction Battalion occurred in 2005 when I was researching racism and the enlistment policies of the Canadian military. A couple of years after that, Kathy contacted me, and we've kept in touch and been working on various projects, whether it's Legacy Voices, Black Canadian Veterans, the Apology Committee for No.2 Construction Battalion. So we've worked together on a lot of these things, and we still keep in touch because there is so much to do on this. Well, for myself, the biggest process is just finding the documentation. There's some at the library and archives, but anytime you start looking at documents, you have to remember that they don't always tell the full story. It's what was prepared at the time within a narrow scope. So you have unit records, but when you want to get a greater context of what was the context in which they were operating, you have to look at more than just No.2 Construction Battalion. There's a local forestry district. There's the railway system in France that delivered them with the supplies. There's all of the infrastructure that goes into supporting a unit, whether it's at the front or whether it's in the rear areas like No.2 Construction Battalion. And then there's also newspaper clippings that give you an idea of what was occurring when they were recruiting, what was occurring back in Canada when they were deployed. You have to draw all of these things together. So there's a lot of research involved, but it's also very fulfilling when you do find something.
From your point of view, when we're talking about reconstructing the history of a marginalized segment of the population, what are some of the challenges that pop up for a historian in that respect?
Okay, for No.2 Construction Battalion and Blacks in the First World War, the numbers are relatively small compared to the 600,000 that were part of the CEF. It was less than 0.25%. So you really have to focus on identifying who they are. I know that with the records that I got from Tamus Gill, he listed them, but he also visited Library and Archives Canada and wrote down all of the files that are linked to No.2 Construction Battalion. So by visiting Library and Archives Canada, and I visited them back in 2010, I got out my camera, myself and a friend by the name of Sarah Anyango, and we took pictures of over 3,000 pieces of paper, about approximately 50 files, and we've held on to them since then. And in 2021-22, Library and Archives Canada digitized those records and made them available online.
Now we have the official records, but then there's also a family component to it. So how do you incorporate descendants into research as you're trying to piece this stuff together?
I know that for me, most of my connections with the descendants are to obtain stories of their family as well as images that are connected. A lot of times there are stories that they've been brought up with which lack a bit of accuracy, but they assume, because they haven't checked, that what they have been told growing up a lot of times is true, where it really is a myth. I think that's one of the challenges that we have.
Yeah, and that I guess is a natural segue into what our episode is about today, which is the idea of kind of a pervasive myths about the No.2. And Kathy, you had provided me with a list of those myths that can continue to be repeated. So maybe we can just jump into it, and we can talk about the first myth on the list, which is the No.2 was formed due to a lack of manpower overseas. What's the truth behind this, Mathias?
There's two aspects to the truth about, was there a manpower shortage? The first part is, yes, in January 1916, the Prime Minister stated they were going to raise 500,000 troops to serve overseas. But the crunch for that wasn't really felt until July, August 1916, and then they noticed the numbers were going down. But they weren't in a panic mode about it until later that autumn. But by that time, No.2 Construction Battalion had been formed. The unit itself was formed because there was pressure from the community onto the military and even the Governor General asking why weren't black men being accepted. So they had to find a solution. And the Chief of the General Staff, General Gwatkin, came up with the idea of having a black labor or construction unit, and that was proposed to the British, who were looking for labor to support the front lines, whether it was moving supplies, building things in the rear area, or even doing some work in the front. And that's why the unit was created, to provide that material support. By material, I mean material in terms of the manpower to provide the troops with the support they needed.
I guess this leads naturally then into the second myth, which is that the men of the No.2 were not allowed to serve as combat troops. Can you unpack that myth?
Question of, were they not allowed to serve as combat troops? They were never intended to be combat troops. It was strictly a unit that would serve in the rear lines. And approximately 75% of all the people who served in the CEF overseas were in support roles, whether it was pay, providing the Army Service Corps with moving the supplies up to the front. So they were not intended to fight, and nowhere is it advertised in any of their recruiting statements, the speeches they gave, that they were intended to fight.
My comment on that is that Blacks were always able to serve. It was the commanding officer that made the decision as to whether or not they would get in. So blacks were serving from the beginning of the war. It's just that there were a number of commanding officers that turned them away, that turned some black soldiers away. So they formed, or they gave the labor battalion as a compromise for some of the men who had been rejected, and it was a higher opportunity for them to be accepted in labor units as opposed to experiencing racism as a result of commanding officers saying no. But they were black soldiers in 1914, 1915, 1916 that were able to get into combat units.
The corollary to that is, even if Canada had formed a black infantry unit, the British refused to employ any black infantry units at the front in Europe. Now, they did employ them in Africa and the Middle East, but not in Europe. That was absolutely forbidden by the British. So even if we had created one, they would never have served at the front. And Canada wasn't willing to go and let them then be sent into Africa or the Middle East, where they had no staff, they had no control over anything with respect to that.
There also weren't the numbers for a black battalion in Canada in order to support. We had to be 1,049 in order to form a battalion. The numbers weren't there.
The military leadership also recognized that in order to maintain a unit in the field, by 1916, if you had 1,000 soldiers in the field, in the battalion, you needed at least 500 a year to maintain it. So if you're talking, say, they get into the field 1917, 18, you've got the 1,000 in the field, plus you need another 1,200 reinforcements just because of the high casualty rates.
What are some of the myths around their work? And then, if you could clarify what they actually did do in their service.
No.2 Construction Battalion did not dig ditches, clear minefields, retrieve wounded from the battlefield. What exactly they did do, I will let Matt explain that.
Yeah. What they did do is provide support to the 3 and sometimes 4 Canadian Forestry Corps companies with whom they operated in the Forêt de la Jus. That support was manyfold. They went out, they helped cut trees, they helped move those trees to the mills, into the big log yards. From those logging yards, they helped move the logs into the mills, they helped run the mills, stack the finished timber, and then help transport it over to the nearby railhead. But it was more than that. They provided the water system. So they ran the entire water system that pumped water from a nearby river into those camps. When the electrical system was built, they ran the electrical system, the whole boilers and all of that, for all of the camps. With respect to the roads, there were existing logging roads in there. The Forêt de la Jus had been used as a place where they took out timber for the old sailing ships for over 200 years. So the logging roads existed, but when you drag logs across them, you've got to keep them maintained, flatten them out. So they maintained those roads. And from the time they got there in May 1917 until roughly November 1917, they helped to build a logging road for one of the logging companies with that. No. 22 company, I believe it was. So they helped build that logging railway. With No. 2 Construction Battalion supporting these forestry companies were able to produce a lot more timber than any other forestry company anywhere. And it actually ended up serving as a model for other areas where the Forestry Corps would dedicate one company to support the other in exactly the same fashion that No.2 Construction Battalion was supporting the forestry companies in Lajou.
This just brings up a point in terms of the reading that I did. In something I read, they had mentioned that there might have been some tension between the French population with regard to how Canada was running their forestry operations in terms of whether or not it was viable for the French forest. Do you know anything about that, Matt?
I do. The French forest, from which timber was taken before the First World War, after the Second World War, they were all carefully managed. So when No.2 Construction Company arrived and the other forestry companies, they were told which areas to log, what logs they could take out. Most of it was clear cut, but the French also required that the stumps that remained also had to be cleared. That was their standard practice. So they had to remove all of those stumps. And that was one of the duties of No.2 Construction Battalion.
Again, another myth that you raised your hand in regard to is the idea that they lived in substandard facilities. So tell us a little bit about camp life for No.2.
Okay, so the facilities, when they first arrived over in England as well as in France, they lived in tents like everybody else. But afterwards, they were living in huts, and the huts had heating. It wasn't substandard compared to the other soldiers. Like, they weren't at the trenches; they were in comfortable surroundings. Part of the myth that turns to substandard housing before they went away, they were in New Brunswick, and they were in type of railway cars to go and remove the rails. So that might be part of the myth in terms of the substandard housing. But when they went overseas, they were not in substandard housing compared to the rest of the soldiers.
So it's comparable to the other forestry soldiers that were there.
Correct.
So then the other kind of side of that coin is the idea of, receiving their pay and supplies and proper clothing. Maybe if Matt, if you want to talk about that idea, maybe where that myth originated, or the idea that this isn't the case.
There's a couple of examples in the documentary evidence that the supplies and pay that they were to receive arrived late. But when you look at the overall situation, the time period when that occurred, it was early 1918. And at that time, the French railway system was overwhelmed. You had the Americans who were arriving, and the railway system had to transport them from the ports up to the front. At the same time, you had the front collapsing in Italy. So now they had to rush troops from the UK, sometimes from northern France, through France, all the way around to Italy. And because of that, you ended up with a railway system that was clogged, and the railway system itself experienced a big shortage of railway cars, whether it was cars to move supplies, box cars, or passenger cars. They weren't available. So the other aspect of this is, under normal circumstances, it would take about 36 hours to move a railway car from the north, from one of the ports there, such as Boulogne, and move it all the way down to Lajou. So 36 hours, because it had to go over 4 different railway systems. There was no unified railway system. So it had 4 different railways. So it's understandable that in all of this, there might be occasions when the supplies and the pay was late, moving from northern France down to southern France.
I'm curious, given the nature of Calvin Ruck's initial work on this subject, and the fact that he was talking to the few survivors that were still around, I'm wondering if it's a disparity between someone's lived experience and what the records show, meaning it's understandable that things be late, and it's late across the board. It's a systemic problem where, even the white soldiers are not getting the supplies they need in time and all that. But when you're talking into a veteran face to face and they're talking about what they went through in the moment, that nuance isn't there. All they know is, well, I didn't get my thing that day. I thought I was going to get my thing.
Oh, I would agree wholeheartedly with that. Soldiers tend to know what is happening around them. They might have an idea of what's happening with respect to the neighborhood, but when it comes to the big picture and understanding what is going on with the railway system and the troubles it was experiencing, they wouldn't be aware of that. It's not going to show up in the local newspapers because that wasn't reported in the local newspapers. They're not going to report, we have a shortage, because that would let the Germans then know, oh, there's a shortage, they're having trouble moving, maybe we should do something about it.
We go naturally into the idea of having the same access to medical treatment and care as white soldiers. I know, maybe Matt, if you could just talk about the one incident that we do know about a doctor refusing care, but then talk about just the general care for these soldiers while they were overseas.
There was one incident where a black soldier wasn't given proper treatment. I believe that was in January 1918. And in this case, the doctor thought this person was just being a slacker trying to get out of working, and therefore he refused to go and treat him, just sent him back to the unit lines. Unfortunately, he wasn't faking, and as a result, he became quite ill, was taken back to the hospital, and passed away. Overall, though, the treatment, when you look at the files for all of these soldiers, they were getting treatment as good as the white soldiers.
Yeah, the soldier that died, his name was John Mansfield, and it is written in Reverend White's diary. And I know that is put out quite a bit in the media, as if most of the black soldiers were experiencing that type of racism, but it's not true based on looking at the records of the individual soldiers, which show that they were treated. It's not just by one soldier, and that's another myth, saying that there was only one doctor that would treat the black soldiers, which was Dr. Murray, which is Anne Murray's grandfather. But one doctor could not look after the entire No.2 Construction Battalion, and they were located in 3 different areas of France. So that's another myth.
So according to the record being Reverend White's war diary, as well as the records of this particular soldier, we know that it's true in the case of Mansfield, but in terms of being a systemic problem for all of the No.2, we just don't know that.
I think that one works both ways, because we don't have anything from the doctors themselves or from the hospital saying what was done or how little was done. What we do have, though, is if you do a comparison between how long the person was in hospital for treatment and compare that with some of the soldiers with whom they served, some of the white soldiers, the treatment time for the same injuries or same illnesses was the same. And in fact, for some of them, it was far better than what the soldiers, black or white, at the front received. So there were some illnesses that I noticed where the soldiers of No.2 Construction Battalion were spending 4 weeks in hospital or light duties then within their unit line, whereas the soldiers at the front, they were only being given 2 weeks for this. So that would suggest that they were being properly treated, if not better so, than the soldiers at the front.
So we evoked his name, Reverend William Andrew White. So one of the myths is that he was the only and or the first black officer in the CEF. So how many black officers served during the First World War?
I'm say there were a total of 8, including Reverend Andrew White. I think that there was only one infantry officer. The rest of the officers were honorary officers, so they're mostly in the medical corps or chaplains. So those were the officers that were there. And Reverend White was made an officer in, I think it was February 1917. And there were other officers that were there before him. So that is easy to document.
So in the case of White, is he also an honorary officer, or is
Yes,
there a special distinction?
He was. He's a chaplain. So chaplains are honorary officers.
And then in terms of the other ones that served, were they there to be with other Black troops that were in other parts of the?
No, they were with non-segregated units.
Now let's go back to number 4. The myth being that number 2 was the only Canadian Expeditionary Force unit in which Black soldiers served. Matt, can you talk a little bit about the number 8 company?
Number 8 company, Canadian Forestry Corps, was formed in late 1918 in order to provide support to the Royal Air Force in France. Now, it was one of 5 such companies that were formed from the Forestry Corps, and its personnel came from different units. So you had some who were from No.2 Construction Battalion who had remained in England. There were Black conscripts, and there were Black volunteers. Now, most of these Black conscripts and volunteers, they had signed up in infantry battalions, but then when they got to the UK, they were removed from that and sent to the Canadian Forestry Corps depot. So that's why there was this large group of Black soldiers available for number 8 the company Forestry Corps. Now, of the roughly 180 people that were in such a company, 165 of them were Black. So that is a very sizable number. For what number 8 company did, they helped improve airfields. So they had horses, graders to go and level things out, rollers to go and flatten things. So they used that when the front moved and the Air Force had to be closer to the front than the troops, a new airfield would be occupied and they would level it. And then when the armistice was declared and the troops marched into Germany, at that time, number 8 company also moved into the occupied territory of Germany and continued that work for the Royal Air Force and even one Royal Australian Air Force squadron. One of the members of number 8 company was someone by the name of Rufus Rockhead. And he was someone who was from Jamaica, and he volunteered, and he was part of 8 company. And also some of the other members that were part of 8 company were some of the conscripts that were supposed to, or who believed would be reinforcing number 2 Construction Battalion. But when they got overseas, a decision was made that they would not be reinforcing them. So if you take a look at the files on number 2 Construction Battalion or number 8 company, and you look at the names, you will see that a lot of them were conscripted in the spring of 1918 under the assumption that a lot of them would be transferred to number 2 Construction Battalion.
In our email correspondence, one of the names you brought up that I hadn't seen before was Private Seymour Arthur Tyler, and the myth that he had served in a combat role overseas. Can you first tell us the myth?
And so one of the myths was that he served at the Battle of Vimy Ridge, and he was part of the Winnipeg Devils, and he enlisted in 1915, which is a myth. He was only part of number 2 Construction Battalion, and he didn't have the opportunity to serve at Vimy. I think he was in quarantine at the time because they had just arrived from overseas, landing in England. So he didn't have an opportunity to be there. I think that when it comes to how that all started, I know that there were a series of interviews that were done where he mentioned that he was at Vimy, and some of those records go back like 5 decades, and he wasn't.
I know for myself, when I see something that's contradictory, we never know, was it the soldier or the media? But when I see so many things, it's the media sometimes isn't aware, because I've seen lots of things saying, oh, this was, what was it now? Oh, the first black officer, the first black pilot, the first black anything, or the first indigenous officer. And I know it's not the case, it's just that the media likes to go and hype things up, so I'm always a little weary. And back in the early 2000s, I noticed that there was a piece that said that Seymour Tyler had won the Victoria Cross. Unfortunately, I think what happened is whoever was looking at his file or had heard something didn't know anything about what the Victory Medal is. They'd never heard of the Victory Medal, which was given out to all veterans. And Victory Medal, Victoria Cross, oh, it was probably the Victoria Cross because they'd heard of that one. Then that showed up in a military newspaper, and it spread from there, because if the military said this, this must be true. And as a result, you get these myths being propagated, duplicated by the government, and then spread from there. Even in the lead up to the apology in No.2 Construction Battalion, there was stuff that Kathy and I were receiving that we were shaking our heads going, where did they get this?
So I think it actually moves us nicely to soldiers becoming veterans and being returning soldiers. So the next myth was that there were no parade for returning soldiers from No.2. Who wants to unpack that myth?
I can say that this week, like the 22nd of January, a large number of soldiers came in on the Empress of Britain. And there were about 3,000 troops, of which approximately 150 were No.2 Construction Battalion soldiers. There wasn't a huge acknowledgement or parade surrounding that, but the week before, there was a 5,000 troops that came, where there was a large parade and acknowledgement of them. With No.2 Construction Battalion, they were sent back in pieces, in different groups based on where they enlisted. So for the group that came, they came back the week before, there was a small percentage that were No.2 Construction Battalion soldiers. So they were able to somewhat experience the celebration and parade, but also shortly afterwards, they had to send them back to the area where they came from. So they were going out west, or they were Americans. So with No.2 Construction Battalion, they were sent back in different groups based on what area they enlisted from. So the group that came the 22nd of January, they were mostly Nova Scotian related pieces. So the volume of people who got an actual parade is relatively small. It's mainly infantry battalions, but the groups like the Forestry Corps, etc., I would say about maybe 70, close to 80% did not receive a parade. So it wasn't just No.2 Construction Battalion. I would say it was about at least 70% that did not receive a parade.
The only thing I would add is that the policy of returning soldiers to different areas and putting them on the same ship, that was something that they started looking at in 1918, what do we do when it comes to demobilization? And looking at the railway system and everything else, in Canada at the militia headquarters and at the Overseas Military Forces of Canada headquarters, they came up with the idea that units would be returned to the area in which they were recruited. It made it easier because the ship would arrive in the port, they would then have a little parade, they would get on the trains and then depart. And all those trains would be heading in the same direction. Whereas if you had some soldiers that were from here, others from there, so some from Manitoba, others from BC, some from Quebec, you'd have too many trains and it would be too difficult logistically. So they asked the soldiers, where would you like to be released? And that was then at Kinmel Park in Wales. That was the camp to which they were sent. They were sent to a camp. That all the people from that camp were going to go onto a ship going to a specific port, and from that port all onto a train taking them to their final release destination.
And that brings us to the last myth I have here on the list, which is the idea that No. 2 was not commemorated after the war because it was an all-black unit. Kathy, do you want to start to unpack that?
The majority of units that were perpetuated or commemorated were combat-related units. I know that for No. 2 Construction Battalion, they did have a commemoration of sorts to honor those who passed away and it was held in 1920 at the Ontario Legislature, honoring those who were in the battalion that passed away. But in terms of perpetuating the story and having like a large commemoration, that didn't occur, I think, mainly because they weren't a combat unit.
I know that Lieutenant Colonel Sutherland actually tried to get the unit perpetuated, Lieutenant Colonel Sutherland being the commanding officer. But because there was no plans to have Canadian Forestry Corps units in the interwar, what became the interwar period, there was no means of perpetuating the unit. Whereas they were going to have artillery, infantry, Army Service Corps, so all of those units would continue after the war, and therefore there was a link between the wartime units and the units in a local area. But with No. 2 Construction Battalion, with no Forestry Corps units, there was nobody to take over the role of perpetuation. Kathy mentioned the plaque at the Toronto Legislature, but I have run across where there was another small plaque installed, and my memory fails me as to where it was, but there were a couple of locations where they did honor the local soldiers, including those from No. 2 Construction Battalion.
To finish up, what is the story of the No. 2, and why are they worth remembering?
I would say that they're worth remembering because of what they had to go through in order to be able to serve. I know that it was mainly done to give members of the Black community who were not being accepted an opportunity to serve. So it was more, I guess, of a pride to allow them to serve. I know that other Black soldiers were able to get in, but it was able to, I guess, like quickly allow a number of soldiers that were not being accepted the ability to get in. And they did a great service being a labor unit. And in terms of getting the wood out to the trenches overseas, they were able to be of great assistance to the Forestry Corps. And I think that there's a level of pride in service, and I think it's an opportunity to go and tell that story, and also to show that there was some racism that was there. I think that's important. That certain things that were able to be overcome.
For me, I think the follow-on to that would be the fact that No.2 Construction Battalion was the largest all-black military unit in the history of Canada. And when you look from Confederation onwards, there were really only two segregated units, No.2 Construction Battalion and No. 8 Company. And when it came to the post-war period, you had blacks serving in the militia, integrated, and the decision was made right from the start of the Second World War, there would be no segregation. So in terms of segregation and a unit for a specific ethnic or call it racial group in Canada, they are quite unique because in 1911, there were calls for a Hindu unit in BC, and that was turned down. There were calls for a Japanese unit in the First World War in BC. That was turned down. So they are actually very, very unique. They're the only race-based battalion that we ever had in Canada.
And just as we close up, is there anything else that we haven't covered that you wanted to make sure was mentioned?
Well, I would like to say that Library and Archives Canada digitized the records of No.2 Construction Battalion in advance of the apology. So these records are available to educators, students, anyone across the world. And UNESCO just in November of this year made those records memories of the world and part of the National Register. So we're encouraging teachers to go and take a look at those records. I know that between myself and Matt and a series of educators and historians, we're putting together lesson plans that identify the myths and the misinformation. So we want to make that public.
No, thank you.
The Black Hum is an original production of Knockabout Media, written and hosted by me, Cindy Charles. This series producers are Ryan Barnett and Cindy Charles. Thanks to funding from Veteran Affairs Canada's Commemorative Partnership Program. If you enjoyed this podcast, please rate and review, as it helps people find the show. This series was recorded by Tyler Rauman at the Community Digital Arts Hub. If you're an educator and want to incorporate this podcast into your classroom, we have a list of discussion questions that can be found in the show notes or downloaded from our website at knockaboutmedia.com. There, you will also find more of our podcast series, including Among Equals, The Story of a National Crime, and Once Upon a Time in Hollywood North. Thank you for listening.
A Knockabout Media original. Hold on.